A, the number of people that sent this to me was insane. B, it confused a lot of people, and it went like super mega viral.
All right, let's see it.
So I get suspicious when anybody, whether it's a televangelist or a politician, tells me that something is central to my faith when Jesus never talks about it. To me, that should, I think, ring alarm bells as to what is the agenda here. What is someone trying to get across? And I think if we're looking at the last 40, 50 years, the religious right has made a concerted effort to make homosexuality and abortion the two biggest issues for Christians.
One thing I'll say is Jesus never said anything about nuclear warheads, bestiality, or paper straws, but they're all awful too.
Yeah.
So that's number one. It's an argument from silence. It's the weakest form of argument. There's tons of stuff Jesus never explicitly talked about that everyone knows are evil.
So this is a flagrant straw man fallacy. Josh is not responding to what Representative Talarico said in that clip. Josh is responding to an entirely different claim that Representative Talarico not only never made, but explicitly distinguished from the argument he was actually making. Because Josh is acting as if what Representative Talarico said was, Jesus never said it, therefore you can't say it's wrong, or therefore it's not wrong, or something like that. And Representative Talarico said absolutely no such thing whatsoever. And in fact, later on in this interview said, I recognize that Christians have scriptures that they will appeal to in defense of their positions on homosexuality and abortion, and that's a debate that we can have. But that's not what I'm arguing. I'm arguing this other thing. Because what Representative Talarico is arguing is that Jesus never said it, therefore he gets suspicious when people try to insist that it is central to Christian identity. And he doesn't like that Christians are trying to make these things the two biggest issues for Christians. And he doesn't like that people automatically assume that because you're a Christian, you must be anti-gay and anti-abortion, because there are many Christians who are not. So his position is about the salience of these positions to Christian identity. And the fact that Jesus never said it, so how can we turn this into central Christian identity markers? That's Representative Talarico's argument, and let's watch him distinguish that position from the claim that Josh is addressing here.
Again, I'm very open for my fellow Christians to disagree with that, and they may have scriptural passages they point to be anti-abortion, and I think that's a debate that we should feel comfortable having. All I'm saying is that it shouldn't be assumed that just because you're a Christian, you are anti-gay or anti-abortion, because there are so many Christians out there who don't subscribe to either of those policy positions.
So, as you can see, Josh is not addressing what Representative Talarico said. Josh is addressing a flagrant straw man fallacy, a claim that Representative Talarico never made and in fact explicitly distinguished from the argument he was actually making. And Josh is addressing a straw man fallacy because he knows he can't really engage Representative Talarico's actual concern competently or in an informed and insightful way. He's just attacking the little apologetic red meat that he has ginned up to attack in place of actually engaging what Representative Talarico actually said.
Yeah, number two, that's just not true. That Jesus never talked about this.
It is absolutely true that Jesus never addressed abortion or homosexuality. And what Josh is going to do is basically insist that you can't tell him he's not allowed to infer things from what Jesus is actually purported to have said in the Gospels.
So what Jesus does over and over again, multiple times in the Gospels, is he defines what is acceptable sexual expression and what is biblical marriage.
So this is a hasty generalization. Jesus is doing no such thing whatsoever. To define is to delineate the boundaries of a category, or to comprehensively catalog the members of a category, or to reduce a category to a set of necessary and sufficient features. And Jesus never once does any of that for either of those things. Jesus describes a couple constituent elements of each of those things. And one of them is a prescription and a proscription, and that has to do with divorce. Jesus says, I'm changing the rules. The law of Moses said you just had to give a woman a writ of divorce to divorce her. I'm saying you're not allowed to divorce her at all, except in cases of sexual immorality. And then Jesus quotes a couple passages from Genesis. And the problem is that folks who want to read their own idea of what appropriate marriage is into the text will exploit the quotation of those two passages from Genesis as an opportunity to infer a bunch of things about Jesus' position on marriage that are not actually in evidence, that are not actually necessary readings of either of those passages from Genesis. For instance, people will say that, well, Jesus said marriage was between one man and one woman because he quoted Genesis 2:24. And that's absolutely not making that case. It's certainly logical to say, well, we could interpret Genesis 2:24 to be saying that marriage is only appropriate when it's between one man and one woman, but we know that's not true of Genesis 2:24 because we know Genesis 2:24 was written by men who had multiple wives and was written in a time when polygamy was perfectly normative within that society. We know Genesis 2:24 does not prescribe marriage only between one man and one woman. So it can't be that. So this is the problem with trying to infer things from texts by imposing, unifying, and generalizing logical frameworks. It's that not everything and not everybody always followed perfectly logical reasoning as they were figuring out their ethical system. So just because they might say this is wrong in one place, and we can say, well, that's logically analogous to this other thing over there, therefore they must have thought that other thing over there was also wrong. That's not necessarily the case. Because again, the folks who are developing these ethical systems were not always perfectly logical, perfectly consistent, and perfectly rational. A lot of it is ad hoc. A lot of it is arbitrary. A lot of it is based on negotiations between received traditions, their social and historical circumstances, and their goals for the future. And those things are just not always logically consistent and rational. So this is an inference that Josh wants to impose upon the text, and in that way allow him to say, well, Jesus comprehensively defined what biblical marriage is, even though all Jesus did was say, hey, I'm changing the rules on divorce.
Jesus never addresses bestiality or incest. Everyone knows those things are wrong.
OnlyFans.
Yeah, only. You know we're talking about OnlyFans.
Everyone knows slavery is wrong as well, and Jesus did address it and condoned it. Jesus condoned evil in the New Testament. But let's talk about this sexual ethic that Josh is addressing. He talks about bestiality, he talks about incest. Those things are actually addressed in the Hebrew Bible's legislation about sexual activity, specifically in Leviticus 18 and Leviticus 20. So Josh is not just bringing up two random things that we know are wrong that we can therefore infer Jesus also must have known were wrong. Josh is talking about things that are a part of Jesus' scriptural heritage. And so the argument is that Jesus endorsed the sexual ethic of the Hebrew Bible, changed some things specifically related to divorce, but must have otherwise agreed with the Torah's sexual ethic. But wait a minute, the Torah's sexual ethic also says that having sex with a woman on her period is an abomination, is evil. That appears repeatedly in the Hebrew Bible. Does Jesus also think that? And therefore must we also think that? Must we condemn sex with a woman on her period, just like we condemn bestiality and incest? So we've got Jesus not addressing things that if we take the Hebrew Bible seriously, we must acknowledge are evil and abominations and wrong, that I think Josh probably doesn't feel so strongly about. And also, Jesus does address some things in a favorable way that we know are evil and wrong, that Josh is not about to say, hey, we need to get back to. So even Josh's approach to interpreting the New Testament and understanding Jesus' morality and what that means about what our morality should be is inconsistent, is not logical and rational and perfectly consistent. So on what grounds can you pretend to say that we are allowed to impose these unifying and generalizing logical frameworks in order to draw out inferences about what Jesus must have condemned and about what Jesus must have felt about biblical marriage and appropriate sexual expression? You have no logical or rational grounds to do that. All you have is the text can't stop me. And that's just arbitrary. That's just dogmatism. That is just trying to proof text, and not in a very competent way.
What Jesus did is he went, man, I'm not going to list every single thing that is wrong. That's impossible. It'll take forever. So let me just go, here's what's right. So this is Matthew 19. Some Pharisees came to him to test him. They asked Jesus, is it lawful for a man to divorce his wife for any and every reason? Jesus responds. So words of Jesus right here.
Well, words of the author of the Gospel of Matthew here, not words of Jesus. We don't know what the actual words of Jesus were.
Haven't you read, he replied, that at the beginning the Creator made them male and female? So transgenderism is out.
No, this passage is addressing sex, not gender. And gender and sex are two different things. And this passage is obviously not saying that transsexuality is out, because that's just an indisputable biological reality. Transsexual people absolutely indisputably exist. Genesis 1:27 is not dictating what is allowed to exist to us. Genesis 1:27 is just a literary composition that, by the way, could be interpreted as a merism, which would mean that trying to insist it makes transsexuality not real or transgenderism not real would be a misreading on your part. So again, this is just trying to use the Bible as a proof text for contemporary right-wing authoritarian ideologies, and in a rather naive and misguided way.
And said, for this reason, a man will leave his father and mother. So, like, lazy, don't work, live in your mom's basement forever, that's out. And be united to his wife. So, in other words, we get married, and the two will become one flesh. What you have there is a sexual, heterosexual, lifelong covenant union between a man and a woman. And Jesus goes, that's what's right. By implication, everything else is out.
So this is an is-ought fallacy. This is not proscribing anything other than marriage between one man and one woman. And we know that because Genesis 1:27 and Genesis 2:24 were written by men for whom and within a society in which polygamy was perfectly acceptable and normative. The authors of both texts probably themselves had multiple wives because it was generally the elites who could afford to marry multiple women, and it was the elites who would have been responsible for the composition of these texts. So just those two passages from Genesis in and of themselves do not by implication condemn anything other than marriage between one man and one woman. Now, you might point out that Jesus is appealing prescriptively to these passages, and you would be correct. Jesus is saying there's something about these passages that makes something inappropriate. But what is made inappropriate by the appeal to these passages? The annulling of a marriage. And that is a very narrow and specific proscription that does not validate or authorize the interpretation of anything else that is relevant to these passages as either prescribed or proscribed. Again, this is the imposition of unifying and generalizing logical frameworks onto something that does not say a specific thing so that we can say, well, by implication, it means the specific thing. And it doesn't. This is not what these passages are being leveraged to assert, and we cannot just assume that because it makes logical sense to us to generalize one thing from another thing, that it would have made logical sense to them. And additionally, just a few verses after this, Jesus tells his disciples that it's better not to get married at all. That celibacy is the higher law, and that's what the most pious are going to do. They're going to make themselves eunuchs for the sake of the kingdom of heaven. So marriage is not even necessary within the eschatology and the soteriology of the Jesus represented by the Gospel of Matthew, which is a very different Jesus from that of Mark or Luke or John or Paul, who also said celibacy is what everybody should be aiming for, and that you should only get married if you can't hack celibacy so that you can have occasional prophylactic passionless sex in order to tamp down the urges so they don't get so pent up that you commit some kind of sexual immorality. For both the author of Matthew and Paul, Jesus was coming back too soon for anybody to change their life circumstances. And there wasn't going to be married people in heaven. There were not going to be romantic entanglements in heaven anyway. Everybody was just going to be like the asexual angels in heaven anyway. And procreation wasn't a concern because, again, Jesus was coming back too soon for any of that to be an issue. So why do we today try to extrapolate all these ideas about the types of marriages that people should aim for when they were saying, don't even get married in the Gospel of Matthew and in the writings of Paul? Well, it's because the Gospel of Matthew and the writings of Paul were mistaken, because they thought Jesus was going to come back too soon for any of us to get married and have kids who then could grow up and be adults who could be prepared for the second coming anyway. They expected the second coming to happen any day now, and they were wrong. Which meant that, oh crap, now we have to come up with some kind of ethical frameworks for getting married and for raising children. But that was something that we had to extrapolate on our own, not only because they didn't say anything about it, but because they were not planning on it, because they did not think it would be a thing, because they thought that Jesus was coming back too soon anyway. So the things you're trying to extrapolate these universalizing, generalizing principles from are texts that were wrong about when all this was going to happen and what we should be doing to prepare for all these things to happen imminently. So we're negotiating with the text one way or another. However you want to approach the New Testament, you have absolutely no choice, no option, no other possibility but to negotiate with it. And the real question is, in that negotiation, what are you giving priority to and why? And in this case, obviously, Josh is giving priority to right-wing authoritarian and social dominance orientation identity politics because that's what best serves the structuring of power and values and boundaries in a way that advances his interests. Because this is not a very thoughtful engagement with the text. This is not a very ethical engagement with the text. This is an engagement that is concerned with structuring power and with identity politics. And that's why Josh cannot actually engage what Representative Talarico actually said, and instead has to gin up this straw man fallacy and attack that with all these presuppositions and these bad apologetics. And the fit for this video has been X-Men 97.